Guys, previously we have discussed the excavation. Today I would like to discuss the Control of Substances Hazardous to Health, or COSHH. Minimum requirements. More one rules legal or contractual requirements shall always take precedence. So first we need to check if our minimum acceptable standard is in legal or in contractual requirements. Higher standards shall be adopted wherever practicable. So if you can apply the higher standard than the minimum requirements, if this is practicable to implement, so go for the higher standard. The reason is we are protecting the life of the person and preventing the damage to the property, including the environment. Health hazard, you see on the rectangle with a man with the damaged body. This is a symbol that the chemical is carcinogen, mutagenicity, reproductive toxicity, respiratory desensitizer, target organ toxicity, and aspiration toxicity. If you see the flame inside of the rectangle or square, you can get the sign of flame. Example, it is flammables, pyrophorics. This one is explode. It will explode. Self-heating, emits flammable gas. Self-reactiveness, organic peroxides. But if you see the exclamation mark inside of the square, it is irritant to eyes, to skin, and skin sensitizer. Acute toxicity, it is harmful. Narcotic effects, respiratory tract irritants, hazardous to ozone layer, and non-mandatory. Gas cylinders, you can see inside of the square a cylinder pictograms, gases under pressure. Okay, if you see some steel with a test tube with a liquid on it, and that the steel is damaged inside of the or in the hand, that means this is corrosive or corrosion. So it skin corrosion or burns, eye damage, or corrosive to metals. If you see some explosive element inside of the square, this is symbols of exploding bomb, explosives, self-reactives, organic peroxides. And if you see flame over a circle, that means is oxidizer. There are some liquid or chemical that oxidizing and producing oxygen to the flame. So that means it will produce the oxygen enough to continue the combustion. So environment, non-mandatory. Aquatic toxicity, so you can see the fish floating on the died fish floating, or dead fish floating on the water, or you can see the trees, no leaves. That means it's harmful to environment. Skull and crossbones, that means acute toxicity, fatal or toxic, or means poison. Okay guys, training and competency is the minimum acceptable standard in the COSHH. All employees shall train on the general awareness familiarization of hazardous materials prior to starting work. Employees handling chemicals should be familiarized with a list of hazardous materials that are banned or restricted by applicable laws and regulations. So we should know the materials that is banned already or restricted as per your local as per your host country or international law as well. So like for example, the asbestos, it's already banned, okay, because it's due to some study, and it is a carcinogen, okay. Competent persons must be appointed to oversee the storage, use, and disposal of hazardous materials. So make sure that we assign a competent persons, okay, to which is having a training, experience, skills, and know how to store and use, disposal of these hazardous materials in case of the waste. So we should find competent persons to handle those chemicals. Risk assessment. So when we are handling risk the cost, we need to make sure that we have a risk assessment or cost assessment shall be performed prior to handling hazardous materials. The assessment shall cover all activities, products, services to identify all hazardous materials that are present, stored, or being handled at the worksite, and the risks associated with them. Okay, we need to make sure before we receive or we order materials to the site, we should have a risk assessment so that when the materials arrive or hazardous material arrive at site, we know already how to handle it and how to prevent accident or risk associated with these chemicals. Implement all reasonably practicable control measures to reduce the harmful effects of hazardous materials on human health and environment by preventing or minimizing emissions, exposures, and hazardous waste generation at source. So when we conducting control measures, we need to consider, okay, the prevention of this emission of these chemicals or hazardous materials, and then we need to make sure that we can prevent or minimize the exposure of anyone or including the environment from this material. So we need to make sure that there is secondary containment, or make sure that the container of the chemical itself is sealed and tight, no leakage, no damage, and make sure that we need to order only enough materials from the site in prioritization order. Don't order bulky materials that we cannot use immediately, because maybe it will expire before the time that we need it. So we need to check the time frame when we will use it and when we need it, so that we can prevent the generation of waste. So don't order immediately if we don't need it now. So just make a program, coordinate with your construction manager or project manager, and together you can identify when this hazardous materials is required at site. Okay, like for example, the thinner is a hazardous material. Okay, so when we need a thinner, okay, hazardous materials storage and handling facilities must perform a risk-based identification of potential emergency scenarios. Okay, so when we are preparing for the storage and also the handling of these materials or hazardous materials, we need to make sure to identify all the potential emergency scenarios, like for example spillage, or when during handling we maybe the forklift will collide on the barrel of these chemicals, then it will having spillage. So we need to identify those in such a case. When this is happened, we know already how to address that situation. We don't need to panic. Okay, this to prevent further damage to environment, and also to exposure of the people on that emergency, and develop corresponding. Remember, not only for if you pollute the environment, also it's very costly to treat the soil, the land. Okay, so you will get more fines from the government, and it is more costly. If you don't have a plan, you are planned to fail. That is a common language, no? And develop corresponding emergency management programs and response plan in consultation with emergency management authorities and other stakeholders. It's always to have a develop emergency management plan, and then make it practice and conduct a drill. So when this happening, especially those people who are directly handling the hazardous materials and storing the materials, issuing the materials, so they should know how to handle it in case of emergency, like we say spillage. Okay, so they should know how to conduct it. You can conduct a spill containment emergency drills to the driver, to the helpers, to the storekeepers, to the users. Okay, so you can conduct so that they are become familiar on how to deal the emergency situation regarding the hazardous material storage and handling. Employees' health and safety. Minimum requirements. Employees in areas where hazardous material are being used or stored must be protected through effective programs for prevention of overexposure to hazardous substance, personal protection, first aid, and medical facilities. Okay, so overexposure to hazardous substance. So we need to make sure that those person are protected, or to prevent themselves from overexposures from that chemical. Like for example, you will provide a enclosure for that chemicals during the withdraw from the drums to the small bucket to be used outside. Okay, so if you are providing the containment area for dispersing that chemical, so you can prevent them from the exposure. And example, you are also using that chemicals for the 8 hours. So you can also make a personal rotation of personnel to minimize their exposure on that chemicals. Okay, that is the first consideration. Okay, and then of course make a small amount of chemicals only to bring in the site, which is required only for the job, and the chemicals that they can finish on the same ship. Don't bring so many chemicals that they cannot use it in one ship. Okay, and of course identify the personal protective equipment or personal protections Okay, so they are protected. Like for example, there are filters that for that the same chemical. So we need to read the methods or material safety data sheets and consult with the safety department to check what is the applicable personal protective for such chemicals. And the first aid, coordinate with make sure that your clinic or first aid station, they have the copy of method statement and the risk assessment plus the material safety data sheet, so that in case of emergency, your first aider, they know how to treat injured persons or exposed persons from that hazardous materials. Okay, so make sure that the first aid arrangement is available. If required more volume of personnel, you need to provide medical facilities. Prohibit eating or changing of clothes within the areas where hazardous materials being stored or used. So it is very clear that when you are eating on this area, you are exposing your labor or cell, okay, on that hazardous materials. So make sure that you provided the site provided separate mess or eating area and also for changing of clothes area, so that we can minimize their exposure. Example, if they are bringing their clothes in the home, so their family exposed on the same hazardous materials, and they will, when they wash their clothes and together with the children clothes or your family clothes, so your family also is exposed on this hazardous material. So we need to identify changing of clothes area near the hazardous area but secured area, so that when the persons will go to the hazardous material storage area, they need to change the clothes before to enter on that area, and then before leaving the area they need to change again the clothes so that they can go outside without having a contaminated clothes. Okay, that is the importance of that changing area for the clothes when you are handling hazardous materials. Employees in areas where hazardous materials are being used or stored must at minimum never use, smell, taste or touch as means for material identification. Don't smell it, don't taste it, or don't touch, so that you can identify the chemicals or materials. Because if this is poisonous, you will be poisoned. Okay, and if this is corrosive, you will get the burn. So don't touch, don't smell chemicals. What you need to do is check the label on that chemicals. Okay, or if you are not trained, coordinate with the trained persons or to identify such chemicals. Okay, refrain from smoking, eating, or from any practice that is hazardous or incompatible with hazardous materials. Welding, example, welding or use of lighter in areas where flammable materials are stored. So this is very clear. If you are introduce the fire, then it will be a disaster in the hazardous materials storage area. Avoid mixing of unknown or incompatible materials. So don't, like for example, the acid. Okay, acid, you mix to another acid, then it will produce explosion or fire. So always follow. This is actually for laboratory area, laboratory chemicals. Always follow the procedures on how to mix chemicals. Okay, don't mix chemicals if you don't know what is that type of chemicals. Coordinate always with the concerned or competent person, responsible person to teach you to identify on how to use or mix that chemicals. Always use compatible and appropriately identified portable containers for transporting even small quantities of hazardous materials. Like for example, you have a bottle of Coke, empty bottle of Coke. You are using it for to get a small quantity of your materials to bring to the site. This is not acceptable because maybe that bottle, an acceptable bottle or inappropriate bottle will melt during use. So what will happen? Your labor will be exposed. Their hand, their body exposed on that spillage of the chemicals, because the container immediately damaged. So always use the appropriate portable containers if you want to transport small quantities of hazardous materials to the site. Never use water bottles for storing chemicals. Okay, there are so many incidents regarding use of water bottles for storing chemicals. Like for example, a thinner. There are some incidents happened before, not only one time, so many times. But when the labor, because the water, the bottled water or water bottles is no label for chemicals. So the thinner they put on the butter bottles. Okay, and then the labor drink that water bottles without knowing that this is a thinner. It's too late that he already swallowed the thinner inside. So what happened? Okay, when he swallowed that chemicals, what happened? He got burning inside of his stomach, and he got injury inside. So always use the appropriate bottles to store small chemical outside. Clean and decontaminate any used PPE after use. So when you use the PPE, example, the coverall, your hand gloves, so always decontaminate after use, so that when you are using it again in the next day, you are safe to use it. And observe all precautions stated in safety data sheets on the relevant materials. Okay. Chemical storage and identifications. Maintain appropriate inventory records, copies of current MSDS profile sheets, and ensure all individual containers and bulk packaging of hazardous materials waste are labeled. Make sure that you have all those labels on your chemicals, so that when your workers came into the chemical room, they know what type of chemical they are looking for. Okay, there is no mistaken, or there is no mistake that they can bring wrong chemicals in the site. So for the sake of this MSDS material safety data sheet, there are some example here. What are the contents of the methods material safety data sheets, or MSDS? Number one, product and company identifications. On the MSDS, you can see the product and company identifications, the hazards identifications of the chemicals, the composition information on the ingredients of the said chemicals, the first aid measures, the firefighting measures, accidental release measures, handling and storage procedures, exposure controls, personal protection or personal protective equipment required, physical and chemical properties. What are the physical and chemical properties of these hazardous materials? Toxicological information of these chemicals, ecological information of these chemicals, disposal considerations. You can see also how you will dispose this chemical in case of expired or waste from this chemical. You can see also that material dataseeds, and what are the transport informations and the regulatory information that you need to know, and other information, like for example the contact numbers of the manufacturers or the emergency personnel or group to respond in case of emergency. Workplaces storing hazardous materials. Using hazardous materials and or generating hazardous waste shall have a hazardous materials management system that includes at a minimum schematic plan of any store showing location of the hazardous material, waste stores, location of emergency and firefighting equipment, and access and escape routes. This is very important. So, example, you have one incident and then the responder, like for example, you call the civil defense to respond, or the Bureau of Fire Department to respond because you have emergency. So this plan is very important so that they know where is the location of the hazardous material storage, and where is the location of the firefighting equipment, and what are the safe escape routes from that location. So this is very important. This is to prevent them to expose on the hazardous materials. Okay? Appropriate storage compatibility risk assessment undertaken. So compatibility risk assessment. So we need to identify all the chemicals if they can store together. Otherwise, you need to separate them in a certain distance, so that because if they are not compatible to each other, it will react to each other, and maybe it will explode, or it will generate harmful gases in your area, or it will generate a fire. So always check the appropriate storage compatibility risk assessment. Limitation on quantities of materials and waste stored, as I discussed. If you limit the quantity, you are limiting the exposure. So if you don't need a huge quantity of these materials, order only a small amount of these materials for your job, and don't bring a large of quantity of material in the sites that they cannot use it in one shift. Okay, because it will expose your buildings and people on the hazardous materials. Storage conditions, procedures to be implemented. So we need to make sure that our storage is good enough to handle or to hold such materials, handling materials or hazardous materials, and make sure that we have procedures when we are withdrawing it, when we are storing it, and there are procedures of how to dispose the waste generated from it. So, and make sure that this is being implemented outside. An updated and accurate inventory of material waste stored, including the following. So make sure that we have inventory updated all the time: name of the hazardous materials, waste, manufacturers of the hazardous materials, location of the hazardous materials and waste, quantity of hazardous materials, waste on site can be averaged, if applicable, expiration date, and hazardous materials. So why expiration date is very important? Because at least we know that our materials, when it will expire, then you can see in the side that you can first issue those materials that near to expire, so that you can eliminate or prevent waste materials in the site. Okay, remember that disposing waste materials, there are countries that they are not allowed, they don't have a treatment plant for hazardous materials or hazardous waste. So they are exporting it to other countries that having a hazardous waste treatment plant. The problem is this is very costly. It is costly because it will be charged. You will be charged for per kilogram of those materials. Okay, make sure also that you keep all those MSDS all the time, even you have finished the materials, because if you have a waste, then they will waste also the handling and storing, transporting of the such hazardous waste based on the material safety data sheets or MSDS. So expired waste and chemicals and waste chemicals and hazardous materials are disposed of through methods or contractors that are approved or permitted. So make sure that all of your chemicals are properly stored. Waste chemical or expired chemical properly stored in the, if you have a color coding system, it's better. And make sure that you are having a list of approved collectors, contractors, so that in case you need to dispose your chemical, it should be disposed by approved collectors. Personal protective equipment, as I discussed, make sure that all of your personal protective equipment is appropriate for such kind of hazardous materials. How we can identify those appropriate PPE is through MSDS. So you can see what is the required PPE in the MSDS while you are handling those chemicals, and use it. As I told, always consult with the safety department to check the specifications of the PPE that you appropriate for that hazardous materials. Example of the PPE, the protective helmets, safety spectacles, goggles, face shields, respiratory protections, gloves, rubber or plastic apron, coveralls, and safety boots. So those are some PPE that we can use when we are handling hazardous materials. But we are not limited on this PPE, so we can add more. Example, the SCBA, if we need a SCBA, not only mask. Okay, so it's not limit only, so it is always check what type of PPE required based on the MSDS, and comply with it so that we can prevent the exposure of our workers and in the hazardous materials. Example for chemical storage and handling, you can see on these pictures, you can see how the acceptable standards handling of the chemicals on the stores. Okay, and the MSDS is also available in the area. The firefighting equipment also is available in the storage area, and secondary containment for the diesel, flammable storage, flammable gas storage, and emergency contact numbers, and also some label or signage to be posted in the area to serve as reminder to our workers when they are on the vicinity. Example of chemical storage again here in the next pictures, you can see here. So for that example, in the right corner, top corner, you can see those people who are trained to use that chemicals Oxygen acetylene is stored separately, and also the secondary containment for the empty chemical container disposal area.